From the time I was a little girl, I dreamed of being on stage, of playing to a full house of cheers and applause. As it turned out, I played a lot of different roles in my life, but I never imagined my final role would be that of a murder victim. I grew up the youngest of 3 girls. I was always the second.
Nancy is very funny, animated, charming to people. Everybody liked her.
She was always smiling. Yes, she lit up a room.
Nancy was 7 years younger than I was. She was like always in a costume of some sort. She was a cowgirl, she was a princess, she was a dancer. She was very animated and loved the camera even when she was young.
I knew early on that I was born to entertain.
Welcome to Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
And I found the best way to do that was to find an audience.
It was her gift to be up there on stage singing and acting. I think being on stage made Nancy feel alive.
But it was off stage where I finally found my perfect co-star.
Nancy loved being married. She loved her husband very much, and they had fun together.
Even after getting married, I was still the baby of the family. But soon, I was expecting one all my own.
The happiest I've ever seen Nancy was that she found out she was pregnant.
It was all she could talk about, all of those new mother things.
I couldn't have written a better storyline myself, but I had no idea the ending was just around the corner.
Nancy and her husband were out to dinner with our whole family celebrating my father's 60th birthday. Nancy started talking about needing to go home and get her rest. They wanted to get to bed on time. The next day was Palm Sunday.
I always loved the peace and quiet of Sunday mornings, but I never liked it when things got too quiet.
My parents were expecting to see Nancy and her husband at church, and they didn't. My father actually swung by the townhouse and saw their cars parked out front.
Even at 25, I was still Daddy's little girl. He always kept a watchful eye on me.
So when my father let himself into the townhouse, the first thing he saw was the broken glass. And then he started getting very worried. And as he came to the top of the basement stairs, he saw Nancy laying on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, and he saw her husband dead next to her.
911, where's your emergency? Unit 522, go ahead.
When the officers arrived, at the base of the stairs were both victims lying on their backs in a very large pool of blood, both obviously deceased. The husband had been restrained because he did have a handcuff on one of his wrists, and it was apparent that he had been killed first.
My husband didn't have a chance to say goodbye. But before I died, there was one last thing I tried to say.
The investigators discovered 3 symbols written in blood next to Nancy. So they had to verify a number of things. Did she write it? What did it mean?
Investigators were right about one thing. I was trying to leave a clue behind. I'm not sure my killer meant to do the same, but he did.
Upstairs, there was a spent bullet that was lying in the floor very near to the stairway going down into the basement. Perhaps his killer accidentally fired the gun. We didn't know. So we didn't release that information to the public at all. Also, it appeared the killer came in through a patio door where he used a glass cutter. The glass had been broken and neatly stacked. We knew somebody wanted to kill them because they took enormous steps to get into that house and wait and kill them. We did believe this was a professional execution.
I truly cannot even put words to the shock and disbelief. Who would kill them? They were beloved. They were the sweetest people in the world.
They were living the American dream. Working, a home, a baby on the way. It didn't seem to be possible.
Someone stole the future I had planned, and police were determined to find my killer. And they started looking in what seemed to be an unusual place.
Nancy and her husband both worked at a coffee company, and they imported Colombian coffee.
The moment I heard that they worked for a coffee company, it was a red flag. In those days, coffee was being used to smuggle cocaine into the United States. And it's possible that Nancy and or her husband either observed this, found information of it, so we did want to see if there was a connection any way whatsoever with this killing.
The closest I ever got to drugs was the caffeine in the coffee we sold. But maybe I was closer to them than I ever imagined. My story was so well scripted. Get married, start a family, and happily live out the rest of my days.
Nancy always had a lot of boyfriends, but when she met the love of her life, she knew it. When they got married, she was the most excited bride I have ever seen. She relished every detail. She had all of the parties. She had all of the showers. She was the most spectacular bride.
Everyone thought I led a charmed life, and I guess I did, until it all came to a shocking end.
It was common that narcotics were being smuggled in from South America through the use of coffee.
Nancy's husband, as plant manager, was seeing all of the traffic in and out of the coffee company plant every day. He saw the shipping of the beans from Colombia.
There was a real possibility. These people perhaps discovered something in the warehouse, saw something they shouldn't have seen.
The investigation was very scary and very hard to think about and imagine. That my sister Nancy was targeted by drug dealers to be murdered.
And for a while, the drug theory was creating quite a buzz.
While there may have been some things within that company that were a little unusual, it wasn't necessarily something we could connect directly to this homicide.
They looked into every possible lead. They checked the plant for drugs. There was nothing.
At that point, we had to pursue other leads.
I know now that when people get killed, it's those closest to them who get the worst of it.
Everybody got investigated. They looked into my father's work and my mother's work and my sister's work. They started calling people that were on our phone list.
It was a very difficult part of this process. This was a family who lost a daughter, and they were a lovely family, or very close, who were devastated.
To have to also be under investigation while you are trying to grieve, it's an impossible combination.
As the youngest in my family, I always got away with murder. Investigators just wanted to make sure my killer didn't do the same.
Midway through the investigation, my investigators were contacted by a federal agency, and it was learned that one of the sisters was involved with a civil rights group involved in the Northern Ireland situation.
My family was always fighting for a good cause. But apparently, some people will stop at nothing to see their cause through.
The IRA is the Irish Republican Army. They would be involved in bombings, killings, assassinations. The federal agents had received credible information of death threats to Nancy Bishop's sister. So we were thinking that the Irish Republican Army having some connection to these double murders, perhaps as a message to her.
My family was everything to me, and I would have taken a bullet for any one of them. But I never imagined my loyalty, or theirs, would ever be tested. Being on stage always seemed natural to me. But suddenly, I found myself under the glare of a spotlight I had never imagined.
The funeral was a week after Nancy and her husband were murdered. How do you do a eulogy for a 25-year-old girl and her husband who were murdered so randomly and so suddenly?
But investigators were beginning to suspect my murder wasn't random at all.
My other sister had done this human rights work in Northern Ireland during a time of civil war and terrorism there. The theory was that Nancy was targeted by the IRA in order to scare off my sister.
Federal agents had received documented information of death threats to Nancy's sister. One of the threats indicating that if she returned to Northern Ireland, she would be killed. She went to Northern Ireland regardless of the threats, and she just got back 3 days before the murders. It was possible that, in fact, this could take place as an intimidation against their real target or a mistake of identity.
My family tried not to bring their work home with them. But investigators wondered if it had followed us somehow.
The IRA did kill people and did kill family members.
I was teaching in a private school in a small town, and when FBI agents show up in a private school and say, "This family is under investigation," the principal of the school pulled me aside and said, "We would like for you to move on because this is just too controversial."
While my pain was long gone, my family's was just beginning.
The investigation was very painful. We tried to cooperate as best we could to give information. We knew that this was serious and that there were serious investigation being done.
My family did everything they could to help all of the investigators. Eventually, they had nothing left to give.
There was nothing more to tell. We had cooperated as fully as we could.
The IRA investigation went on for some time, but it seemed to be going nowhere, and we hit a brick wall.
Ultimately, we began to hear less and less from them, and the FBI just sort of faded quietly out.
Even though we'd been murdered, in the end, we were just a couple from a small suburb. And maybe that's where the investigation should have stayed.
I remember my mother saying, "Who would come into this townhouse, into Winnetka, and shoot them? I think we need to be looking around here."
My family was closer to the truth than anyone knew. But in order to find it, you have to know what you're looking for.
Approximately 2 months into this investigation, I felt strongly that I needed some fresh eyes.
Chief Tim came to me and asked me if I would take a look at the Bishop homicide. After I looked over the initial case and the crime scene photos, the witness statements from the people they had interviewed, really there was nothing. I had no ideas about who might have done this. It was a mystery.
All mysteries are meant to be solved. But my family began to wonder if investigators would ever solve mine.
We would never let go of hope, but we did start to have to focus back on our day-to-day lives.
I know life has to go on. I also know it can change at any given moment.
Approximately 6 months into the investigation, the front desk called me and they said, there's a teenager at the front desk, a boy. He said he had just seen evidence of a crime in someone's home. He wouldn't give me his name. He wouldn't tell me what crime it was. He just seemed very nervous.
When I used to get nervous, I never could get the words to come out right. And this kid was no different.
I finally just say to him, you're just gonna have to tell me what crime you're talking about. And at that point, he said, I know who killed Nancy Bishop and her husband.
Some kids will tell the wildest stories just to get a little attention. And if that's what this kid was after, he sure got what he was looking for. I never got a chance to be a mother, but if I had, I would have taught my kids to tell the truth no matter what.
Approximately 6 months into this investigation, a teenage boy came into the Winnetka Police Department and told Patty McConnell that he had information about the killing of Nancy Bishop and her husband.
I said, okay, who do you think did it? And he said, well, my friend did it. I said, well, what evidence do you have? So he told me everything that his friend had. He had handcuffs, he had the gun, he had a glass cutter. Nothing he had told me was anything that hadn't been in the newspaper. I was kind of getting ready to dismiss this kid until he told me that his friend had fired a shot because he got nervous.
That was something he shouldn't have known about. It hadn't been in the papers at all.
At that point, all the hair on my arms stood on end. We had recovered a round from very low in the house near the baseboard of the wall. And no one knew that. It was a detail that had not been given out. So I knew at that moment that he was telling me the truth. And I said to him, who is your friend? And he said, David Biro.
David Biro was just another kid in our neighborhood. I never knew much about this kid, but plenty of other people were about to.
I immediately got one of the on-duty officers to go over and sit on the Biro house to make sure that the evidence, or David himself, didn't leave that house. That afternoon, David gets into his car and takes off. So they immediately stopped him and took him into custody. In the execution of the search warrant, we recovered the gun, the handcuffs, the glass cutter.
I guess a lot of us think we're invincible. And it turns out, my killer was no different.
He seemed almost to be toying with us during the interview. He was very arrogant. He clearly thought that he was smarter than the police. He denied that he had done it.
But the kid in the hot seat couldn't outsmart the smoking gun.
The bullets that were recovered from the crime scene matched the gun that was recovered from David's room. That was the key piece of evidence. We were able to formally charge David Biro with the murders of Nancy Bishop and her husband.
When I got the call that they had made an arrest, I was shocked to learn it was a local teenager.
How could a 16-year-old Winnetka resident possibly have done something so heinous?
This young man was very intelligent. He had it all going for him. And what did he want to be? David Biro told his friends that he wanted to be a hitman. He intentionally walked into that home and surprised them when they came in, subsequently executed the husband, and then shot Nancy Bishop 3 times.
My opinion was that he had no conscience, no remorse. I would call him a sociopath.
My husband and I, and the baby we never had, were killed by a boy who had no love in his heart and no soul to speak of.
So at the trial, after the state presented all of the physical evidence, David ultimately was convicted of the murder of Nancy Bishop and her husband.
I went to the trial to try to make sense and to understand how someone would execute a plan such as this. And at the end, I was left with no understanding.
My story ended tragically, but I made sure I left my legacy of love for those I had to leave behind.
We decided to release information to the public for the first time about the 3 symbols that we discovered written in blood at that crime scene. Nancy wrote, I heart you. The letter I, a heart, and a U. And obviously, it was a message to her husband and to anyone who would find her.
Every day has been about trying to honor her dying words of love and trying to remember Nancy and her loving heart in her life. That's the most important thing.
I was lucky enough in my short life to find the greatest co-stars a girl could ever ask for. And for that, I was given the role of a lifetime. From the time I was a little girl, I dreamed of being on stage, of playing to a full house of cheers and applause. As it turned out, I played a lot of different roles in my life, but I never imagined my final role would be that of a murder victim. I grew up the youngest of 3 girls. I was always the center.
Nancy is very funny, animated, charming to people. Everybody liked her.
She was always smiling. Yes, she lit up a room.
Nancy was 7 years younger than I was. She was like always in a costume of some sort. She was a cowgirl, she was a princess, she was a dancer. She was very animated and loved the camera even when she was young.
I knew early on that I was born to entertain.
Welcome to Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous.
And I found the best way to do that was to find an audience.
It was her gift to be up there on stage singing and acting. I think being on stage made Nancy feel alive.
But it was off stage where I finally found my perfect co-star.
Nancy loved being married. She loved her husband very much, and they had fun together.
Even after getting married, I was still the baby of the family. But soon, I was expecting one all my own.
The happiest I've ever seen Nancy was that she found out she was pregnant.
It was all she could talk about, all of those new mother things.
I couldn't have written a better storyline myself, but I had no idea the ending was just around the corner.
Nancy and her husband were out to dinner with our whole family celebrating my father's 60th birthday. Nancy started talking about needing to go home and get her rest. They wanted to get to bed on time. The next day was Palm Sunday.
I always loved the peace and quiet of Sunday mornings, but I never liked it when things got too quiet.
My parents were expecting to see Nancy and her husband at church, and they didn't. My father actually swung by the townhouse and saw their cars parked out front.
Even at 25, I was still Daddy's little girl. He always kept a watchful eye on me.